Okay, start. Hello everyone. Today I'd like to do a survey video and exhibit on the precursor history of the Buffalo Freedom Fields monument and what extent service was conducted in the service of the United States Army and how that change in perception by the public and recognition by the Army and other government organizations has played an impact to lead up to this recent change at West Point in September of 2021. But I think it's important that baseline information is provided. Now, this is not going to be a fully comprehensive every single aspect of the United States, colored troops or for the Buffalo Soldiers or the cavalry, but this is going to give a baseline understanding for it. Okay. So, historical context. In May 22nd, 1863, the United States colored troops were established by the War Department General Order number 143 for the U.S. Civil War. This was not the first African American regiment to be formed. There were volunteer units, in particular in Kansas, who had fought very valiantly, and thus the idea gained more esteem by Governor Andrew in Massachusetts, and also by advocates for African American civil rights, such as Frederick Douglass. At this time, they wouldn't have really been. It wouldn't have been called civil rights per se. It would have been called it would have been for abolitionists, the getting rid of slavery. But in the terms of the way we would think about it, I guess it would be a primordial or early civil rights movement. So, anyways, to give you some perspective, the United States colored troops composed 10% of the Union Army, approximating 179,000 soldiers. It was a little bit less than that, I believe. Whereas Louisiana provided the most African American soldiers from the South at 24,000, roughly, soldiers. And this was possible because of movements in New Orleans to capture it, the whole Anaconda strategy and so forth. This attempt to split off the Confederacy. Now, in the North, interesting enough, Pennsylvania provided the most African American soldiers at about 8,600 soldiers, roughly. And from this, we got many units, but one of the most famous ones was the actions of the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, Volunteer Regiment, that was famous for the Battle of Fort Wagner, South Carolina. They tried to take Charleston and so forth. It was not accomplished. However, the actions in July 1863 showed ability and legitimacy for a call for permanent soldiers to be enlisted into the United States Army. And so, after this event and other events related, there was a huge recruitment effort by African American soldiers. I think over 100,000 were recruited. So it was a major effort. This was a major point, and it is iconified or memorialized in popular media from the movie Glory in 1989, which, if you haven't seen, it's well worth watching. Anyways, after the end of the Civil War, there was a lot of African American soldiers who, not African American soldiers in themselves, African American males who had been freed from slavery, who had been given a chance, in their perspective, to show that they deserve to be United States citizens with all relevant and not privileged, but all consequence of that, meaning they wanted to be treated just as well as white Americans, and so they were given their chance. Furthermore, on July 28th, 1866, the Army Reorganization Act in Congress created 6 regiments of African American soldiers. permanently. So these were not going to be dismissed after a conflict. These were going to exist for the future. Now, from initial trading for the rest of this 1866, we get to 1867 onwards. The United States at this time was very much still involved in westward expansion past the Mississippi. And so the United States government saw it profitable and needed to expand past the Homestead Acts and so forth. So they used cavalry soldiers in particular to police, maintain, and supply the frontier forts, and in regions as far as New Mexico, Texas, out west, Montana, and so forth. And they were expected lies. I know that in Texas, you had, I believe, under 1,000 soldiers on horses who had to police the area from El Paso to San Antonio, which is a massive distance. I mean, it takes over 6 hours each way by car. So you can imagine the kind of difficulty trying to police that area. They were based out of Fort Stockton, I believe, and Fort Davis. And so they got involved in many military engagements with indigenous tribes and confederations of said tribes, the Kiowa, the Comanche, Apache, so forth, the Cheyenne. Examples of this include the Great Plains Wars, the Red River War, 1874. They had issues at trying to track down Victorio in 1880. He was basically running guerrilla tactics, as it was perceived, in Texas and Mexico, and also for their Apache Wars and Comanche engagements. And from these victories, especially after Custer, then Custer's downfall, his defeat, they were able to secure the lands, and they placed the remaining native indigenous people into what are called the reservations now. So, and for those who didn't, I guess you could argue they assimilated to society as much as one could, but it is a very contentious issue, of course, to modern day activists and civil rights activists and historians and so forth. Okay. So during this time period, there was a lot of racial animus that still existed. The Buffalo Soldiers didn't really get credit. I mean, they had done things as widely as protecting Yellowstone National Park, Yosemite, so forth, from hunters and all sorts of things. But when that movement was getting off the ground, but it wouldn't be until really the Spanish-American War in 1898 where recognition was given more thoroughly for the soldiers. An example of this was the 10th Cavalry. They fought with future President Roosevelt's Rough Rider Volunteer Cavalry Regiment at the Battle of San Juan Hill. That was also led by Leonard Wood, who would also be prominent. But anyways, so they capture the hill. They basically occupy the majority of Cuba, but that was not a finished business, and the 9th Cavalry had to step in and keep the occupation going while they were taking Puerto Rico and so forth, because many of the soldiers were incapacitated by different tropical diseases, including malaria, and based off of racial ideas at the time, that Buffalo Soldiers were more protected from things like malaria and so forth. They were decided to stay. Now, to be clear, many of these soldiers still got malaria, but that was not a major concern for the Army at the time, and so they continued it until the Treaty of Paris was signed. So, okay. Like I touched upon earlier, there was racial conflicts involved in stationing of Buffalo Soldiers. And just to be clear, if I haven't mentioned it before, Buffalo Soldiers, the idea of that is kind of contested, but some say it comes from the indigenous tribes. They had called the buffalo, I think it was the Cheyenne or Kiowa, because they perceived them looking like buffalo. I'm not exactly sure. I think that's not a settled issue, but the Buffalo Soldier mantra has stuck. So now back to the settlements of the soldiers. In 1899, Fort Ringgold, which is in the border area around Laredo and Brownsville, is kind of in the middle area. They had a fort there, Old Fort Brown, and there was an incident with the people, also in Laredo, and basically the federal troops fought the locals, and the Texas Rangers also were involved, and thus, they were kind of like, they wanted to move. Rio Grande City was never really a port of entry, unlike El Paso, so it kind of like lost its mobility until about the Mexican Revolution. So, but unfortunately, in 1906, the Brownsville raid. So there was a murder. I believe a saloon owner was killed by the locals, and essentially after back and forth, after August 13, 1906, the soldiers were investigated, and basically the soldiers hadn't done anything. And we can back this up by further evidence, but nobody wanted to say someone did it when they didn't, and thus, because President Roosevelt was under political pressure, and just probably due to his own beliefs as well, he decided to dishonorably discharge, as Commander-in-Chief, 167 soldiers. And the order was executed. It was planned out and performed by Secretary of War William Taft, who had just come back from being governor of the Philippines. So that was really controversial, but that is what the public saw for a very long time. Now, that is going to lead up into how Buffalo soldiers, in a way, were placed in West Point is due to some of the racial animus. Okay, so for another major event, also 11 years later, there was the Camp Logan riots, where the camps had been constructed in part with help of contractors and Buffalo soldiers. However, there was constant racial discrimination against these soldiers, these contractors, other people who interact with them who are white. They would, say nasty things, racial insults towards the Buffalo soldiers, and the Buffalo soldiers were very restricted on what they could do in return because this was Jim Crow laws in the state of Texas. So the soldiers had to deal with it, and for some of the soldiers, anger started building up over time. So what really got the riot to occur, they changed commands to a Major Snow from I believe a very competent leader named Newman, I believe it was, and he left before things took off. Major Snow takes over, and he didn't really have the same kind of connection with his soldiers. Now, to be clear, this officer class, they were all white Americans, so they weren't African American, and for Major Snow, from accounts, he was kind of removed from his soldier. Like, he didn't really talk to them as much as he could have. And so the real event happened is that a Corporal Baltimore and other onlookers were seeing a situation with the police, and then they went to intervene, and two police officers in particular, one named Officer Sparks, he decided to, instead of treating some of the Corporal Baltimore with respect that he was due, he decided to hit him multiple times with his gun, and he felt, and he couldn't hit the cop back because that's a good way to get murdered. So he ran for cover and basically was brutalized. They threw him in jail, the Corporal Baltimore, and he was so messed up that when his regiment found him, members of that, they basically were trying to convince him to not say much, and he agreed to that, Baltimore that is. But Snow and his officer class, they didn't decide to tell the rest of the soldiers what happened. They didn't explain it, and so there was rumors going around that Baltimore was killed, and thus people who had this building anger decided, now is the time to get revenge. And thus, throughout the night, some of the soldiers left the camp. And I should clarify, this was not all the soldiers, but some of the soldiers decided to go out, and they started shooting at police officers, and some civilians were killed as well. And after all, I believe 4 Buffalo soldiers died, including one of the ringleaders, Sergeant Henry. But 19 dead were total, including police officers. One of the officers was Sparks, and it was a bad situation. And due to the way it was portrayed and just different social economic factors, the African American population of this area in Houston did not support the soldiers in their mutiny, as they would have called it. So this was not always the case, but yeah, the local people thought the soldiers were in the wrong. So that was not very good. And so this precedence also led to decisions by President Wilson to punish people. And he did this in a way by not allowing these Buffalo soldiers to participate in combat in World War I. To give us a perspective, Wilson was a lawyer and academic from Georgia, very bigoted for today's standards. And I believe he wrote a biography of General Robert E. Lee and really admired the man, which, obviously a controversial person who had slaves and so forth. And so he and his Secretary of War did not want to give opportunities to African Americans like before. And in fact, he himself and his administration decided to segregate federal buildings. So this was not what African Americans have been fighting for. This was a backtrack for different groups, all because of a couple situations. So to give you a picture from Old Fort Brown, it's from SMU, which I will provide credits at the end, to show kind of the situation they were living in. Okay, so Buffalo soldiers at West Point. So this is where we're going to get into specifically how they ended up at West Point. 3 officers graduated from West Point until 1889. However, Young, who was very famous, would be the last graduate until 1936. So to give you some perspective, so we have Henry O. Flipper, who was stationed in Texas. Supposedly, a lot of the accounts of his court-martial were that he basically, they had claimed he had stolen money, but in reality, it seems like he had got on with a sister of one of the ladies of the group, the settlement in Fort Davis, and she was white, and some of the soldiers did not like that, so they used their corruption to sabotage him. And although he was kicked out of the Army, he stayed loyal to the United States in many ways and became an expert on Mexican affairs and actually assisted the United States in some of its Mexican endeavors. The number 2 graduate, John Hanks Alexander, he was a very promising guy, very good at engineering and math. Unfortunately for him, though, he had a heart disease and he died at age 30. So unfortunately, he was not able to live out a career. Whereas Charles Young, he did a lot in his career. In fact, I believe he was one of the superintendents of Yellowstone National Park, or what would become Yellowstone National Park. But the Army moved him around a lot because he kept moving up in the ranks and he was very skilled, but they didn't want him leading white soldiers, so they kept moving him around, and he did a lot of work in Western Africa. And unfortunately, they decided instead of giving him what he had earned, they decided to instead cause him to die in Western Africa. Some speculate because they knew that they were going to send a weak man. He had been weakened by illness in his later years, and they sent him to Africa, where he'd be exposed to Western Africa to different diseases, and it finally killed him. I believe it was in 1922. So 1936 was important because we were in FDR's day, and racial animus had decreased. Jim Crow laws were not as strong in the North, and thus you get a fourth graduate who would be involved with aviation and the Tuskegee Airmen. I think it was Benjamin Davis Jr., I believe, or it might have been Sr., but... So, anyways, for African-American soldiers at West Point, they had arrived in 1907. There's 3 different units. There's cavalry, medical, and mass. Mass was food, basically, and other services. The 9th and 10th Cavalry would go on to distinguish themselves when the 9th Cavalry arrived on March 23rd, 1907 from Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. That's where the United States Colored Troop were established as permanent units, one of them. And so it was an important place. The arrival was not generally commented on by the press because they felt that the issues in Brownsville were going to come back and haunt them. So, yeah. Now, in 1906, the area that the 9th took over for, that cavalry unit was considered very poor. It was not very strong in its implementation of orders or maintaining anything. One of the issues that there was too much to maintain, but within a year, the 9th Cavalry had improved performance in the soldiers under their jurisdiction. The media began to take notice. And even within a year, Japanese Army General Tamemoto Kuroyoki visited West Point in May 1907, and the 9th Cavalry provided escorts to him, and the media commented on their fine performance. By 1908, the reputation of the soldiers caused a waiting list to enter the unit. Officers were chosen, so these are still white officers, but they were chosen only from those with excellent records. So that was very important. You know, they weren't going to let just anybody take over that. They wanted somebody who had skills, and as we could see the issue with Major Snow, that was definitely an important decision. So here's a image of Henry Flipper. This is the Lieutenant Alexander. Unfortunately, he ended up dying young. And this is Major Charles Young, who at this point, I believe he was a couple years from death at this point, but he well-established career, of course. He had done a lot for the Army, and he took his last posting, even though he knew that it was probably going to kill him. So, and he stood as a legacy for many African American soldiers and beyond. So, one of the appealing things, though, for the soldiers who got into West Point, that is, to work there, would be that they stayed in the post for long durations, and many sons would take over, and they would do the same or similar positions. Soldiers were allowed to marry, which was a unusual thing. Only in Fort Leavenworth at the time was that allowed to happen. What's interesting, so they were allowed to marry. Medical apparatuses were available, and facilities were available to African American soldiers, to all. So really the major divide with the medical was between the enlisted and officers, and even that becomes less pronounced over time. But education was also integrated, which was very important. First step to see, a model of this. So now the soldiers had access to fairly new construction, and it would maintain itself for years. There was a school established there by federal funds on an Army installation. It was notable for that as well. So it was integrated, and it was a new idea for federal funds. September 9th, 1907. Now, that being said, there were some downsides, of course. Buffalo soldiers were only allowed cadet barracks, academic buildings, and made parade grounds if they had official business. So they kind of had to walk around certain buildings and things if they were not there on orders or business. Now, like I mentioned before, a divide between enlisted officer class persisted, but loosened for some buildings beginning in the late 1920s. So over time, it kind of eased up a little bit, but this was towards the end of the history, not before. So for the official end for these units, whereas that so the 10th Cavalry had replaced the 9th in 1931, but on September 1st, 1947, the Army, seeing its results in Europe and just different ways of how the world was moving, the Army conducted a modernization campaign, and the Buffalo Soldier regiments were deactivated and reassigned to mess. All the soldiers were put in mess, which for men who had been used to training on horses and teaching the abilities of using cavalry tactics, this was quite an insult. Now, this would continue until 1948, when President Truman executed Order 9981 to eradicate racial segregation in the units. Formally, this did not get rid of racism by any stretch of the imagination, but the divide between the units was eliminated on the paper. So, debates and controversies about the roles of the Buffalo Soldiers in general is that this is mostly in the West, but it would carry over also to West Point because of the military academy status. So it's still relevant. You have the issue of the role of African American soldiers in American Indian Wars in the Western United States. You had historical racial tensions between whites and African Americans and different groups. You had accolades and memorials not corresponding to service for many years, and it's still arguably the case. And then you also had a low amount of Medal of Honors awarded given the service of these soldiers. So now, to get specifically on the memorial itself, we're going to talk about how some of the changes started happening, especially from the 1960s onwards. So 1967, I didn't put this here, but there was a book, it was talking about a history of black cavalry in the West. They used a different word, but I'm substituting it. And basically it catalogs the kind of service that was happening in West Texas, and it brings about, what kind of ordeal and service that was required of these soldiers. It's not easy by any stretch of the imagination. And that played a role into further research. But for West Point's statue, I think there's an argument to be made that in 1970, John D. Weaver, a historian, published The Brownsville Raid. This book provided evidence that the 167 members of the 25th Infantry, so these were the units that had been at Brownsville, were not given due process as prescribed in the United States Constitution. Congressman Augustus F. Hawkins of California, in response to reading this book, pushed for a bill to reinvestigate the events and legal actions. In 1972, the Army found the 25th Infantry to be innocent. President Nixon pardoned the soldiers and gave honorable discharges for them, but he didn't give them back pay to their families because at this point only, I believe, 2 Buffalo soldiers were still alive. I think one did get a pension. I think it was like $25,000. So, but generally, yeah, there was, they didn't get back pay. Their family didn't. Now, what's interesting is, this happens. Nixon the next year pardons the soldiers. But then the United States Military Academy at West Point decided to rename a field where the cavalry training occurred by the Buffalo Soldiers at West Point to honor the 9th and 10th Cavalry. So they renamed this field that had been used for sports and horse training in the past after them. Now, since that action, it was very significant. Since 1973, more monuments have arisen for African American service in the Army in places such as Kansas, Alabama, Texas, etc. You can see little markers that you'll normally see around the country in places where they were stationed. But that being said, one of the more major ones was in 1992, the Buffalo Soldier Monument dedicated at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. Its remembrance and other elements of the service were being advocated by figures such as General Colin Powell, of course, would be prominent in the Bush administration. and others. Now, based off of that, more work was done, but also since the late 2000s, the Buffalo Soldiers Association of West Point had established a committee to design, fund, and build a monument to Buffalo Soldiers at Buffalo Soldiers Field to replace the Memorial Rock. So they, at the field in '73, they established a rock, and it's a decent size, and I'll show you next. But they really felt like a statue was justified due to this comparative nature, and other places with similar service records of white soldiers. There had been plenty of bronze monuments, so they and other allies in the West Point Museum worked together to make this happen. And so this is the rock. This is what was there for roughly about 40 years, 37. And so, you know, it talked about this, but as you can see, if you weren't really looking for it, it wasn't easy to find. Like, if you were knowledgeable about this and, you know, you had been prepared or you'd lived in the area, maybe you've seen it, but for tourists and stuff, it's very easy to miss. Very easy to miss. So that's the perception that many people had. And so they decided, organization decided to change this. And so, to give you a perspective, this is a Fort Leavenworth statue from 1992, made by Eddie Dixon. It's over a waterfall, and he's gallantry stopping before he falls over. And so here is the field itself. Give you some perspective. So the rock was out of the way. You know, it wasn't easy to see in this large field, and you had streets going each way. So, like I said, I mean, if you went on a tour and you're specifically looking for it, you could have found it, but it wasn't the most noticeable thing. However, this is what is now here in the field. So September 10th, 11th, 2021. This is one of the ceremony, and I've got some more pictures. Here's the other side by the same artist, same sculptor, that is, Eddie Dixon from Texas. And this is what he designed. Looks great. And the West Point Museum contributed to make sure the uniform and everything was consistent with the historical time period. So here is the sculpture here, right here, in front of the West Point statue. And as you can see, the base is very large, much easier to see for people. And as you can see, shuttle buses, tour guides are going to see that much easier. So it was big news. Here's a further close-up. The Buffalo Soldier Motorcycle Club, which had, they're kind of like, I think they were formed in the early 90s, and they were, basically, they go out and try to help the communities out and education of the Buffalo Soldiers, and, you know, it seems like a real decent group. And here they are celebrating the statue. So, and here are some of the sources of books for this presentation. Here's some incomplete image sources, but most of these are in the public domain anyways, so worked by the government. Anyways, thank you for watching, and have a nice day.